What I see the absolute most of is moral scrupulosity and harm OCD. So moral scrupulosity is the fear of being a bad person, fear that we're doing bad things, and therefore doing a lot of compulsions.
OCD is so much more than being neat or organized. But those misconceptions mean many people go undiagnosed. How does OCD really show up? How does it overlap with ADHD and autism? And why can reassurance sometimes make things worse? Therapist and advocate Natalia Aíza joins us to break it all down. That's straight ahead on episode 263. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
You have so much potential. It's supposed to be encouraging, but for a lot of neurodivergent people, it lands differently. It feels like a reminder of all the ways they're falling short, of expectations they never agreed to in the first place. I think about the kids who've been told they're bright but not applying themselves, who hear that they could do great things if they'd only try harder, get more organized, or stay focused. And I wonder, what if the problem isn't effort? What if it's the way we define success? Potential isn't a straight line. It's not something you measure by productivity or grades. It's curiosity, creativity, resilience. It's the ability to think in ways no one else does. Maybe success isn't about pushing harder, but about finding the right space to thrive. That's why we focus on helping educators and professionals shift their perspective through the Neurodiversity University. Our professional development courses are designed to move beyond outdated ideas of wasted potential and into practical, affirming strategies that actually support neurodivergent learners. We are always expanding our offerings, so if you want to stay in the loop, you can join our podcast mailing list at neurodiversitypodcast.com or follow us on social media and be the first to know when new trainings and resources become available. Because when we change the way we see potential, we change the way we support it. My conversation with Natalia is up in a minute.
Hey there, educators. Since you're listening to this podcast, we know you're passionate about unlocking the potential of every student. That's why we started the Neurodiversity University and developed our course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. It was created by the host of this podcast, Emily Kircher-Morris, who's a former educator who works with school districts, organizations, and companies to help them understand and serve people with learning differences. This course gives you the tools to help students of all neurotypes, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and more, thrive. It's available for in-house professional development, site licenses for districts, and independent study for teachers and parents. Go to neurodiversity.university or call us at 929-445-8255. Look for a link in the show notes.
Today, I'm joined by Natalia Aíza. Natalia is a therapist, parent trainer, and advocate dedicated to increasing awareness and improving treatment for individuals with obsessive-compulsive disorder. She's the co-founder of Kairos Wellness Collective, a therapy center specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders, where she not only supports individuals on their healing journey, but also works to enhance competency among mental health professionals. Beyond her clinical work, Natalia shares free psychoeducation and advocacy through her Instagram platform, where her handle is letstalk.ocd, where she helps to break down stigma and promote evidence-based treatment. So, Natalia, thank you so much for being with me today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Emily.
I think this is an important conversation because there's a lot of misunderstanding about OCD. And I know a lot of people really think of it, even still, about cleanliness or organization. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that. I know I've had conversations with people who are often surprised to learn about some of the less visible compulsions or intrusive thoughts that come along with OCD. So just to start our conversation, can we break down some of the most common myths about OCD and how those misconceptions impact diagnosis.
Absolutely. And I'm going to use a neurodiversity focus here. So I'll be speaking mostly geared towards individuals with ADHD, ASD, and other neurodiverse presentations. And the reason for doing that is that it's even more confusing to diagnose OCD when you have an otherwise neurodivergent brain. So OCD is absolutely nothing the way that we think it is. It truly is an enigma to me why so many professionals, let alone the public, but so many professionals have such strong misconceptions on what it actually looks like. I personally went through grad school with a severe OCD, not understanding, realizing that what I had was OCD and not generalized anxiety. So the basic format of OCD is there is some trigger, there is some fear or obsession, and sometimes there's an intrusive thought that comes in connection to that fear or obsession. And then we do something, mental or physical, in order to help us feel less anxiety. So that is like the beginning. That's the most important link. That's the distinction that makes OCD not GAD, that it is very specific to certain fears, and that we feel the need to do something, even if it's something mental, in order to stop that anxious feeling. So what happens in the OCD cycle is once we do that thing, let's say it's a mental check, or it's a physical tap, or it's avoidance, because avoidance is the number one compulsion. Then what we're actually doing is feeling better in the moment, yay, but long-term, we're reinforcing our fear. So if I have a fear of the grocery store and the contaminants of the grocery store, and I get it delivered instead, yay, I feel better today. But long-term, I have actually reinforced my phobia of the grocery store, and it'll be harder and harder for me to ever step foot in there again.
Right. A lot of the things that we do reinforce the things that it's like this pattern.
Yes.
I'm curious about some of the different types. Like you mentioned contamination. Mm-hmm. I know when I have clients come into the office and they're talking about maybe anxiety or like whatever else it might be that's going on. And when we dig into it, it really does fall into that OCD pattern, but they wouldn't have ever considered the topic that they're talking about would even fall into that category.
Yes, absolutely. So I use contamination as my first example, but I would actually say that contamination is one of the least frequent types of OCD that I see in my center. What I see the absolute most of is moral scrupulosity and harm OCD. So moral scrupulosity is the fear of being a bad person, fear that we're doing bad things, and therefore doing a lot of compulsions like people pleasing, being overly kind, overly nice, basically anxious about whether or not we're making the right choice or we're doing the right thing. So there's moral scrupulosity, which can also be religious scrupulosity. So quite a few individuals who are religious have a fear of doing it wrong, believing in their religion in the wrong way, or somehow betraying their God. That's related to scrupulosity. So that's one big common bucket that I see. And the other is harm OCD. And that's actually what I suffered from most significantly in my lifetime. So harm OCD is the fear that you're going to harm yourself or others. And usually we're focused on the fear of harming others and doing something that is unwittingly or intentionally hurtful. So I have a knife here in my office that I have to use quite a lot with my clients. They have to practice putting this knife up to my neck and realizing that they're not actually going to harm me, even when they have every opportunity to do so.
Yeah, because it's that fear that is so impactful.
Yes.
I know that there are also like some topics that are kind of taboo, that we wouldn't like, that people have these intrusive thoughts about things, kind of goes along with that harm OCD.
Yes.
Like things that I shouldn't be thinking.
Yes. So taboo OCD is things like pedophilia, incest, bestiality, having intrusive sexual thoughts or unwanted desires for a person that, like, for example, your therapist or your teacher. These are incredibly common. Again, it's a fear of harm. So I kind of bucket most of the sexuality in the taboo intrusive thoughts and in harm OCD. Not everyone conceptualizes it that way, but it's not a fear that we have these perverse intentions. It's more a fear that we might act on them and somehow do something deeply wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So what OCD is doing is it's like looking, it's literally searching, what is something that can really shock this person's brain? So, for me, once my children were born, pedophilia OCD started, or what if I sexually harm my children? I also had a fear of murdering my children, a very strong fear of that. None of these were based in any actual moral character of mine. However, my OCD tried to focus on what I cared about most, which was my children at that, at that stage and who I had the most power over. So in that sense, OCD simply targets us wherever we have strong emotions, and it uses that strong emotion in order to torture us, frankly.
You mentioned specifically that there's kind of this connection, but also separation from OCD with anxiety. And so can you talk a little bit about, more specifically, about what really sets the OCD apart from, say, a generalized anxiety diagnosis?
Yeah. So I like to use the metaphor of anxiety is precaution, anxiety is concern, anxiety is just kind of worry that's by definition more general. And when we have this worry, we don't necessarily feel like we need to be all hands on deck about it. So OCD is kind of a next level. It's clicking into an exaggerated and unhelpful response to that anxiety. So, the other day, there was a whole SWAT team in my neighborhood that descended on this tech school because there was a kid on the roof, and the SWAT team went in. There were many ambulances, fire trucks, the whole 9 yards. And it turns out this kiddo was just having a smoke on the top of the roof, right? So OCD is like a SWAT team coming in for a situation that really just needs, a stern talking to. Mm-hmm. So when we are in this kind of modality or we have this neurodiversity of OCD, our brain is constantly overreacting to triggers and overestimating how much danger they will bring.
Which then sets into motion the compulsion piece, right? Like the thing I have to do to get rid of that thought.
Exactly. And that's the proverbial SWAT team that comes in and polices thoughts and polices pretty innocuous situations and exaggerates their severity and also our responsibility in that scenario.
So you mentioned specifically that OCD frequently coexists with some of these other neurodivergent conditions.
Yes.
I know when people think of OCD, they often imagine something that's very rigid and structured, but with ADHD, that can look really different. So why don't we talk about that overlap of OCD and ADHD a little bit more in depth, and then we'll kind of go into some other labels as well.
So that's my brain, and it is the brain of many others. I actually started my career as a neurodiversity specialist, and I ended up pivoting into OCD because I felt like so many of my clients were underdiagnosed with OCD because of their neurodiversity. So when we think of ADHD, we think of impulsivity, we think of more chaos, and then OCD is over here being like highly controlled, highly rigid, like you said. So in my brain, these two forces are like in a tug of war. I can really feel the days when my OCD is activated, my ADHD kind of sits down and like stays out of it, and vice versa. So when I first discovered that I had pretty severe OCD was when I started taking ADHD meds. And I was suddenly like in a place where I could compulse for hours. And previously, my ADHD had kind of distracted me too much to get hyper focused on any of my compulsions. And once I was on the right meds for ADHD, I was all hands on deck for the OCD.
Wow. That's interesting to kind of think about. What are some other ways that might show up for individuals? Like I'm thinking, maybe if they're a little bit younger, like what might it look like externally?
So it's very diverse the way it looks like externally. I get a lot of parents that tell me there's no way my child has OCD. Their room's a mess. So that's like, that's my constant battle with parents of being like, no, it's not about ordering, arranging, organization, cleanliness. Yes, for some small subset of people, that is what OCD looks like. But especially for those of us with ADHD, it's more along the lines of perfectionism. So we know we make mistakes. And so we end up making a lot of checking behaviors or rituals out of fear that we're going to make a mistake. It can also present as compulsive worry that you're missing something. So imagine like with my ADHD, my mind wanders. I miss huge parts of conversations and lectures, they're just gone. And my OCD came on over the top saying like, Natalia, you should be ashamed of yourself. You missed all this material. Now you have to go home and read the textbook 3 times. So I developed all of these coping strategies for my ADHD with my OCD that actually made both disorders fly under the radar because they were essentially working against each other.
It's interesting to think about sometimes with ADHD, even if like the OCD isn't present, there's also kind of this low level little t trauma that occurs for ADHDers.
Oh, yeah.
Which can then manifest as hypervigilance, which I could see that can be difficult to tease out because that might look or even feel similar.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So I, at one point, had 4 children under the age of 5, which is tough for anyone, but for someone with severe ADHD, that is very tough. And I had this intrusive fear that I was going to lose one of them. And so I developed a compulsion of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, all day long, 1, 2, 3, 4, even if I was in my house with them. And that was my OCD's reaction to this deep-seated fear that I was going to do something. I was going to make this big mistake that would cost one of them their lives, which again comes from a lifetime of trauma of having made mistakes, looking down at my phone and cause an accident and other sort of like impulsive things that my ADHD brain has done that has actually caused danger for myself or others.
So how about autism? For a lot of my clients who I work with in the clinical setting, that can be really difficult to tease out. And I feel like sometimes autism can even open the door for some of those OCD patterns to form even a little bit more intensely.
So autism and OCD, it's a whole other episode because it is an incredibly complex dual diagnosis. And please, if you're listening to this and your child or yourself has the dual diagnosis, I think that it's imperative to have a therapist that understands both. You can't simply work with a specialist in autism or a specialist in OCD. There truly has to be the dual specialty. And the reason for that is that even for the person themselves, it can be confusing. What's a compulsion and what's a stim? What's a compulsion and what's safety behavior due to sensory difficulties? So if you use the example of misophonia, which is it's categorized as OCD, it's an avoidance and an intense disgust of the sound of chewing. A lot of autistic people have that, and no amount of systematic desensitization will, cause them to feel better about the sound of chewing. And so you don't want to do systematic desensitization. In other words, repeating the trigger over and over if it's actually related to that person's autism, because you're essentially torturing them in that scenario. And, as practitioners of OCD, we have to understand what is behavioralism that can help someone let go of OCD tendencies, and what is behavioralism that is neurodiversity non-celebratory. And we cannot let ourselves accidentally go into this space where we are pushing someone in a way that will not benefit them.
So I need to come back to this topic of misophonia for a second. So this is something that I deal with. And the way I have often attributed it for myself has been more along with the ADHD and the sensory, like part of it is like the distraction from the noise, and that causes some of that emotionality. But having all of those experiences, I've always thought of it more of a sensory thing. But even when I've read about it and helped my own clients with it, I was unaware that it was often viewed within kind of the realm of OCD. Can you talk a little bit more about how that fits there specifically?
Absolutely. So when we put something in the realm of OCD versus neurodiversity, the key is that there is anxiety provoked. It's not just disgust. There's more to it than that. So with misophonia, specifically to chewing, it is often linked to emetophobia, which is the fear of vomiting or the fear of basically disgust. Mm-hmm. And so as the sound of chewing is related to people with the digestive system, and the smacking sound can cause a sense of oh, I'm going to feel nauseous about this. So the person with OCD wants to avoid any trigger that might cause that nausea, that disgust, that fear of vomiting. And so they stay away from that sound, or they, have a lot of reactivity towards it.
And so on the flip side, if it's more related to that neurodivergence, it's more the sensory piece.
Yes.
Yeah, that is so interesting to kind of tease out that way a little bit. So misophonia, though, specifically, does that term apply in both situations?
It does.
Okay. So it's not like it's only people are misusing it when they're talking about a sensory sensitivity with neurodivergence. It could be either or.
Yes, it could be either or. And there's a lot of terms that, in the ASD world, there's collecting. In the OCD world, there's hoarding. There's subtle differences between collecting and hoarding, but those two are sometimes used interchangeably and they should not be. But even the person with autism sometimes can't quite distinguish what is a hoarding tendency and what's a collecting tendency. So, I say all this with a big asterisk that these are aspects of the brain that we don't fully understand. And you can be neurodiversity affirming and treat the parts of the person's OCD that are causing them harm and limiting their lives.
Another thing that often comes up when someone is experiencing OCD is this idea of reassurance seeking,
Yes.
Whether that's with a parent or a teacher or a therapist or a partner, whoever it is, looking for this validation. It might come across as someone who's just seeming like they're really needy, or, a lot of different emotions that other person who is receiving that might experience. But the problem with this, of course, is that in the context of OCD, as you provide that reassurance, you're actually feeding into it a little bit.
Yes.
And so can you talk about why reassurance seeking can be counterproductive and how we can actually respond in a way that helps?
That's a big question as well. And one that I work with a lot of parents on, because as parents, we want so much to be comforting. We want to be that soothing presence. We don't want to devalidate our child's emotions. We want to be communicative and responsive, especially this new movement towards positive parenting. However, what might accidentally happen is that in trying to reassure your child and trying to soothe them, you might be feeding into the OCD cycle. So a lot of times I actually bring a couple in or I bring a parent-child duo in, and I notice how the child's OCD is utilizing the parent for compulsions. If we use the example of the child with emetophobia, with fear of vomiting, they might ask their parent, am I going to be sick? Am I going to vomit? Am I okay? And the parent, in answering that, is actually fueling the OCD. And so we coach parents to say, I hear that you're worried. They can also respond, it sounds like your OCD wants reassurance. Kids usually hate that. People with OCD, we don't do good with someone telling us that it's the OCD, but it is true. It is the OCD. Another response that we can have instead of reassuring is just being quiet. Because doing therapy for OCD, we do learn that is a compulsion. And then there are times with neurodiversity that compulsion is coming from a place where we maybe have time blindness. So we might say, am I late? What time is it? How much longer do we have? That might be a reassurance seeking that comes from a really legitimate core. And yet the anxiety about the time blindness is getting amplified by the compulsion.
I feel like one of the areas sometimes where the reassurance seeking might come up is with another type of OCD that I don't think we mentioned at the beginning called Just Right OCD. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might fit in with this?
Absolutely. So Just Right OCD is actually more of an internal process. So you can't quite explain it. There's something that feels like things have aligned in a way that is satisfying to us. If you say to a person, well, adjust it until it's just right, we can't really explain that otherwise. Sometimes just right can present in relationships. So wanting a just right relationship, which can cause compulsions such as having way too many conversations about the relationship, checking, like, do you love me? Are you mad at me? Is everything okay? So Just Right OCD can actually span all of the themes of OCD, but it's more that internal feeling of correctness, of safety that happens when we can actually drop the rope, stop the compulsion, and move on.
Yeah, I had a client who was experiencing this specifically. She was a student. And what she would do is whenever she was doing an assignment, she would be writing something, and sometimes she would be writing a word and it just wouldn't feel right. And so she would have to erase it and rewrite it over and over and over until it felt right. She couldn't really articulate what that was. There was nothing different about what she was writing, but somehow in her mind, there was something about either the handwriting or how, I don't know, whatever it might have been. But it wasn't even like writing different words, like trying to find a different term to put in, that sentence. It was literally writing the same word over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Yeah.
It's also a form of perfectionism. And perfectionism OCD is very common among those of us with ADHD. You would think that it wouldn't be, but it is, for a population that has a tendency to kind of rush through things, restarting and, sort of holding yourself to this almost impossible standard is a very common behavior.
We talked about the avoidance piece.
Yes.
I want to think a little bit about things that people wouldn't catch as OCD behaviors that really are. And the one that comes to mind, you've mentioned like perfectionism. I would say even like defiance can look that way when really it's like based on a compulsion. But another huge one that comes up is school refusal.
Oh, yes. Let's talk.
Tell me a little bit about what that looks like, how that manifests, and is there anything specific that we can do to support that? And I guess also, I'm throwing a lot of questions at you here, but how do we differentiate OCD-related school refusal from, like, for example, like burnout, in neurodivergent people?
That is an incredibly important question. And I hate to keep saying this, but it's worthy of a full hour. School refusal is such a big problem in our society right now. I'm actually presenting at the ADA conference next month specifically on neurodiversity and school refusal. The reason why we have such an explosion of school refusal is because parents have become more accommodating. Schools have become more accommodating.
Yeah.
When it comes to neurodiversity, accommodations are helpful. However, in the world of OCD, accommodations are actually quite problematic. Accommodations make our OCD worse. So let's take the example of the child who is neurodiverse and potentially meets the criteria for OCD. They might have phantom stomach aches every Monday morning, and their parent not wanting to push them too far out of their comfort zone, assuming that this has to do with difficulty with missing assignments or bullying at school, allows them to stay home in the comfort and safety of their bed and their relationship with their parent. What ends up happening is that snowballs. Suddenly that child is having more and more early morning stomach aches, and it becomes entrenched as a pattern. And if you think about it, why wouldn't it? Home is not exposing. Home is incredibly safe, incredibly supportive. And out there in the world, there are all of these anxiety triggers. And so what ends up happening is this child is forming neural pathways of home safe, school dangerous. And school refusal is really the early form of agoraphobia. When adults don't leave the house very often, they are actually fearful of their fear triggers. So they are experiencing fear of the fear, and they are choosing to stay in a safe environment rather than face fear out in the world.
That's an interesting connection that I hadn't heard made before, but it makes a lot of sense. And so what should we do for these kids? Like, how do we help them?
It's a hard question. I would encourage parents to look at the work of Dr. Ellie Leibowitz at the Yale Child Study Center.
He's been on the podcast, actually. We'll put a link to the episode in the show notes.
Oh, he is my absolute hero when it comes to parental changes. He understands how difficult it is to push your child into discomfort, but he urges us as parents, please, believe that your child can be uncomfortable. Believe that your child can be anxious. They actually are able to deal with these difficult situations. As much as we want to protect them from these experiences, we really are not doing them any favors by allowing them to avoid their fear triggers. We are actually making them believe that they are less strong rather than believing that they are capable. So I would say parents, send your kids to school. Don't allow your child to believe that they aren't strong enough and capable enough to face whatever it is at school that is dysregulating them. So, again, we can provide accommodations. We can provide, a slow re-entry into school for a child that has been out of the school system due to school refusal for a while. However, perpetuating a pattern where the child is allowed to stay home will only make the child more avoidant.
Yeah. Natalia, this conversation has been eye-opening, and I'm so grateful for your expertise. As we wrap up our conversation, I have one last question for you. If you were talking to someone who is struggling with OCD and they're just starting along this path to work through it, what would you say to them? What are the words of encouragement that you would really want them to hear?
I really want people to know that on the other side of OCD is freedom. You have to pass through so much anxiety. I get it, to get to the other side, but my life, now that I'm in subclinical OCD, is so much better. It is so much happier. It's so much freer. And I would do it again multiple times over in order to feel this way again, rather than to live in constant fear and anxiety.
Natalia Aíza of the Kairos Wellness Collective, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Stereotypes about OCD, ADHD, and other neurodivergent conditions don't just create misunderstandings. They can keep people from getting the support they need at any age. If we think of OCD as just hand washing, or assume ADHD always looks like a kid bouncing off the walls, we're going to miss a lot of people who don't fit those narrow ideas. And when those misconceptions shape the way teachers, parents, and even professionals interpret behavior, kids and adults alike can end up misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. Instead of getting the right support, they're left feeling frustrated, misunderstood, or even ashamed for something they can't control. When we look beyond those surface-level assumptions, everything changes. The more we understand about how these conditions really show up, the better we can make sure people get the right interventions, whether they're in school, at work, or just trying to navigate daily life. Because a diagnosis isn't just a label. It's a tool that can open doors to support and self-understanding. And when people feel truly seen for who they are, they don't just get help, they gain the confidence to move forward in a way that actually works for them. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Natalia Aíza. If you want more information about her work, you can find links in the show notes. Oh, also, if you haven't done it, please join our Facebook group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. There's a link to that and all of our social media spaces in the show notes and, of course, on our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.